Nothing will crush a real estate investor's spirit like landlord stress. The difference between being successful and miserable in managing properties is education. Welcome to Landlord University, where landlords learn. Landlord University is recorded from inside the RentPrep office, where Stephen White and Jeff Pearson share the lessons learned from working with some of the most successful landlords.
Welcome to Landlord University Night School. I'm Jeff Pearson, and I'm here tonight with my co-host,
Stephen White.
Hello, Stephen. How are you doing this evening?
Pretty good, Jeff. Looks like we're going to be jumping into banning smoking at a rental property. Can landlords do it?
Right. And of course, I mean, they can't ban something like smoking. Those smokers should have their rights to do whatever they want, right?
Well, not exactly. So smokers they're not a protected class. So ultimately, there are really no laws that are going to stop a landlord from saying, listen, as part of our lease agreement, you are not allowed to smoke on the premise. They have the right to be able to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Matter of fact, I had a friend a couple years back who the landlord not only said you can't smoke in the house, so then he would go out on the porch. And then the landlord, when he re-signed his lease, put in there, you can't even smoke on the porch. You can't smoke on the property, period.
Wow.
So it was, he didn't want it on the porch. He didn't want it near the property. And right before we jumped on this podcast, we were talking ahead of time, and you had mentioned that in communities, this was a big issue because, you're affecting the other people around you. So they have the same rules. You can't smoke, in the apartment community. And a lot of times you can't smoke in the common areas either.
Right. Yeah. And one of the big things there is people who go outside and smoke on their balcony in an apartment complex, and that smoke goes to all of the other houses around them. And some of the newspaper stories I've seen, and it makes perfect sense to me, you have that one house where this person's smoke just always goes into. So that person is always getting the effects of the smoke from the smoker who is, below them, right, or above them or whatever.
Right.
And so these apartment complexes are starting to implement these types of bans. And there have been some laws, and I didn't do a lot of research in advance, but there have been some laws that allow them to be able to do that on a wide scale. And I think that goes back to what you said about this not being a protected class. So if you want to ban them, you can. But I think as a landlord, you have to be careful of what you want to do, because if you say, I don't want any smokers, I don't want any pets, I don't want any people with blue cars, you can limit your available pool of tenants pretty significantly. And really, what are you trying to accomplish? When you say no smokers, is it most important to you that they don't smoke inside your unit, which makes a ton of sense? None of us want to have a unit that people have been smoking in. Turning that thing over, you have to replace the carpets, you have to repaint all the walls. You get so much that you have to deal with when people smoke inside. But the question is, can you come up with some type of a solution? I mean, is it really affecting you as a landlord if they smoke outside? And maybe, not under the patio cover, which, kind of brings it back into the house and stuff like that. But is there an area, beyond that, yes, they can smoke and it's not going to affect you and your property? And at what point are you imposing your values on them by saying you can't smoke in the backyard, even though you've got this big, huge backyard? It's not a fire issue in that particular area. So those are some of the things that landlords need to take into account, because really we want the best tenants we can possibly get. And if the best tenant or the best candidate happens to smoke and is willing to smoke in a 10-foot area in the backyard, is that worth doing? And it's a question we all have to ask ourselves.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's a lot of ways in the same, along the same lines as the pet. You can say, I'm not going to allow pets, but how many potentially good renters are you eliminating, from your selection pool? So I know a lot of landlords that struggle with that and struggle with making the decision of, well, I don't want to rent pets, but geez, it just seems like everybody that's responding to my ad is asking me, do I allow pets? Same thing with smoking. So I think as long as you have clear-cut rules, I'm all for the outside smoking. I don't want to push my values on anybody else.
Exactly.
I don't particularly care if they smoke. It matters to me not whatsoever. But I agree. In the house, it's a safety issue. It's an issue as a landlord that you're going to have to go in there and probably have the place professionally cleaned. It's the difference between just going in there and throwing an extra coat of paint on versus going in there and ripping carpets out and everything else that has sort of that stained, smoke smell to it.
Hmm.
So I think it, like you mentioned, it makes perfect sense to ban it from inside the dwelling, but as long as you have very clear cut rules, policies in place outside, um, I don't see an issue with it.
I tend to agree. And again, this really goes towards, because in a perfect world, if we could say nobody smokes, and then we could take it to the next step and we could say no alcohol, because we know, 80 to 90% of the police responses to our rental properties are going to be as a result of alcohol. So, we can make this a never ending cycle of all of the people and things that we ban, but we have to be realistic because we want the best tenants we can possibly get. And sometimes they will happen to smoke.
Yeah.
And so, you know,
And I definitely feel like a lot of landlords completely overlook, especially new landlords, they completely overlook this element. Um, they may just have a free lease agreement that they printed offline, or they just don't have the foresight yet to think ahead because they haven't had to deal with a property that somebody's been smoking in for 5 years and never cracked a window.
mhm.
Um, so a lot of times they make these kind of rookie mistakes where they don't have very clear cut rules put in place. They don't have an area, or they don't have a place to collect the cigarette butts and everything else. So then they're sort of on this reactive sort of path where they're constantly reacting to it, and they're reacting to neighbors complaining, or they're coming over there to check the property out and they see cigarette butts all over the place, all over the driveway or the sidewalk or whatever. And then they've got to be the bad guy and tell them, listen, you can't do this, and you got to wait for the next lease to come out to be able to put something in there. So it's good to be prepared ahead of time, not only in writing, obviously with the addendum, with the smoking addendum, but make it real clear as you're doing the walkthrough. Take them through to the smoking area if you have one, which you should. So
Yes.
listen, this is the area. If you smoke, this is where you would do it. If you are a smoker, your responsibility is to clean the butts out of the bucket or whatever the case is. But everything's prepared for you. Do it over here.
Right. And if you're a landlord and you have a property and you have a tenant, let's say you do have an agreement that they don't smoke inside, so they go outside, and then you get a call from your neighbor. Those situations where you used to live in the house, now you've moved out and you're renting it, and you know all the neighbors, and your neighbor comes to you and says, this guy that just moved in, he's smoking all the time. It's right next to my window. I'm getting it in my house. Again, going back to the customer service of being a landlord, you want to make sure that the neighbors are taken care of. Um, and when there's something you can do to help something like that, you certainly want to do it because they are helping you to protect your property. So
Right.
then you go back to the tenant and you have a nice, friendly conversation. And, one, thank them for smoking outside and not inside. You really appreciate that. But we have this neighbor that's getting a lot of smoke in their house. Is there something we can do to help them? Can we move it over to a different part? Have a friendly conversation with them and see if you can come to a solution that's good for your tenant and good for the neighbor. And if you've been dealing with things with that customer service concept in mind from the beginning, then odds are your tenant's not going to think twice about it. They're going to say, oh man, yeah, I hate that I'm causing the neighbors to be upset. Let's see what we can do about this. And more often than not, I would think they're going to work with you to find a better place for them to do that doesn't affect the neighbors.
Yeah, and I agree, and I can definitely see some landlords listening to this right now, Jeff, saying, "No way, you're crazy. You can't have a nice conversation. They're not going to listen to you. You don't understand. You can't rationalize with an unreasonable person." Um, but I think a lot of it goes back to the screening process. You're screening to find the right tenant with good character, good qualities. And if you don't, if you're making sure you're not renting to that passive aggressive tenant, I think that you can have a good conversation and have it go exactly like you just said. And make sure everything is obviously documented. We talked about before keeping that sort of like landlord logbook, right, of every
Hmm.
incident or anything that ever happens, document it. If you have to give them a notice or whatever, if they're violating the agreement or whatever happens. Um, but you never want to go in there guns blazing. I'm the sheriff. These are the rules. I think you hit it right in the head. I think most landlords that do take that sort of approach of, listen, I do appreciate you following the rules, not smoking in the place, but we have this issue. In your specific case, I think most people are reasonable and can
I
be
think so.
reasoned with in that
Yeah.
way.
My experience with all of my tenants, I can't think of a time with a tenant that I didn't feel that I could go and ask them just about anything. Can
Hmm.
we make this adjustment? Because I always do try to, I think of it from their side first and then think about what I'm asking them. And usually there's some give and take. This is the situation we're facing. Is there some way we can make an adjustment? If there's something that I need to do as your landlord, I'm happy to do it, but let's see if we can find a simple solution. And I even think of my one worst tenant who I ended up having to go through the courts to evict up until the point that he couldn't afford to make his rent payments.
Hmm.
I was able to work with him great. It
Hmm.
was only at the point where I think he knew he didn't have enough money and he was just trying to extend the time
Right.
that dealing with him started to become an issue. But up until that point, no problems with anything. I could have a conversation with him. It was friendly. Hey, could we do this? Hey, I'm having a problem with this. Can you not do that anymore? Sure, not a problem.
Right.
And it was never an order. You can't do this anymore.
Right.
I tried to take my normal tone of conversation with him, and it tends to work. I can't think of any situations where I've had people just really balk and say absolutely not. Now, part of that comes, like you said, from the quality of tenants as well as the relationship that I establish with them from the beginning to let them know that I want them to feel that this is their home and not have to worry about the evil landlord. And my goal is to make their stay there as pleasant as possible and to essentially stay out of their hair unless there's something that needs to be addressed. First of all, take care of whatever they need taken care of. If they need something taken care of, let me know. And if there are things that I need to do, I'm going to take care of them. But aside from that, I want them to feel that this is their house and they're comfortable to live in it. And it tends to work.
Yeah, I agree. And, it goes back to, we've mentioned before too, that the good tenants, the good renters are doing just as much screening to make sure they have the right landlord. I promise you that landlord that, immediately jumps, starts everything off on the wrong foot and doesn't take that approach of trying to be amicable at first. I promise you, they have terrible turnover rates. They have, vacancies all the time. People aren't going to be with them a long time. At least they're driving the quality tenants away.
Exactly.
So yeah, I think, it kind of comes full circle. We started talking about smoking, but I think it really always comes down to good communication and making sure that everyone's aware of the rules. Don't just think that they're going to know them. You have to go through them with them and say, here's what it is.
Yes, very true. And that reminds me, I've talked in the last couple of episodes about customer service as a landlord, and I think that's something that we need to talk about as an episode.
Yeah,
Just really talking about the fact that you are in the customer service business when you're a landlord, and what are the things that you can do. And so we will be sure to include that as one of our episodes in the coming weeks.
definitely. And I wish I can find some of these, because there's going to be other guys on the other side of the fence. I'm thinking of some of these landlord association meetings I've gone to, the ones who have that real hard headedness, super prideful type of attitude where they say, I'll never do cash for keys because it's, I'm bowing down to the tenant and showing them that I'm weaker than them and I'm giving up and I'm losing and, I have to pay them. And
Yes.
it's such a mental block for them and such a pride issue that they're the ones that sort of kind of create most of the problems themselves. So I'd love to have somebody on like that and just deconstruct their thought process, right? And say,
Yeah.
I just want to know what you're thinking, because, you know, I think the nice landlords in this case, or most cases for landlords, nice guy doesn't always necessarily finish last for landlords. I
Correct.
think a lot goes to how you treat people for sure.
Right. And we can get into it when we talk about this, but being a nice guy as a landlord is not a problem as long as you follow all of these documentation issues that we've talked about in all of the episodes up to this point. If you make it clear what your expectations are for everything, and then you hold them to it, but you do it in a nice way, you can be as successful, if not more successful, as a landlord than the person who expects the same things, but does it in a way that makes the tenants uncomfortable.
Right.
Yelling at them or telling them are wrong or telling them, well, this is the rule, you have to do it this way. You can approach it a whole different way. And that's part of what we need to talk about in customer service as a landlord in that episode. So that'll
Definitely.
be fun.
It'd be how to not be a nightmare tenant or a nightmare landlord, rather.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
There's always a couple of bad eggs that give everyone else a bad name, and I think that a lot of times there's sort of this bad image, like you said, the big bad landlord earlier. I think a lot of that comes from those type of landlords that sort of make a name for landlords in general. But there's a lot out there that are trying to do it the right way and treat people respectfully, and they're the successful ones probably too.
Yep, I agree. Well, great, Stephen. That wraps up another evening of Night School. I will talk with you tomorrow evening.
All right. Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks for listening to Landlord University. And remember to visit rentprep.com/landlordu to see show notes and access free resources like forms and guides. And be sure to check out Jeff Pearson hosting his own hit podcast at thementorimpact.com.